Okay, we're back. We're on part two. I think this will take maybe 20, 25, 30 minutes at most, okay? We're going to be focusing on New York, and I'm calling this Wild Promise and Corruption. I got asked earlier by Tanvi about why Nick feels like he does at the end when he leaves New York, and that's one of the things that we'll definitely be covering, okay? Well, why Wild Promise? Well, one of the most beautiful, extraordinary, poetic parts of the book, and I was saying to Munro earlier, don't forget that Fitzgerald's daughter later says that Fitzgerald said that he wrote the novel agonizingly slowly with John Keats open beside him, infusing the novel with his poetry. And I think it's a beautiful novel, isn't it? It's filled with extraordinary imagery and synesthesia, just like a kind of romantic poet in a way. And I think this is one of the great descriptions of it. So from the Queensborough Bridge, as you go into New York, it seems like an absolute magical place, doesn't it? It says, doesn't it, that with the sunlight through the girders, making a constant flicker upon the moving cars. I wanted to remind you of something. That aside from this incredible poetic beauty, there's also stark realism in this book, isn't there? It's just like Streetcar Named Desire, isn't it? Where you have, it's infused with all this kind of poetry and epicness and intertextuality and stuff, but on the other hand, it has domestic violence and rape and a dark side, and this is just the same. All you need to do is look at the way Myrtle dies, with her breast ripped and her blood soaking into the earth. And it's a shocking graphic image, isn't it? Now, getting back to this particular scene, so we have this realist depiction of the steel girders, but look how we go into a magical fairyland, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps and sugar lumps, all built with a wish out of non-olfactory money. If there's one phrase you're going to learn, you need to learn that phrase. So why is it that here the money doesn't stink? Well, part of that is to do with which Nick is narrating. There's not one narrator Nick in Gatsby, is there? There's Nick that comes to New York, who sees everything with a sense of excitement and freshness, isn't there? Just like people when they go to live to California the first time, it's been a few months, they're going through all the junkies in LA, and California doesn't quite seem the same. Then there's Nick at the end of the novel, who's exhausted, cynical, and broken. In one of the essays I've given you to take home, it reminds you that Baz Luhrmann, when he made the brilliant film of Gatsby, he put Nick into an asylum as a broken alcoholic. I'd be careful putting that into your exam because it's not in the text. But it's interesting in so much as that's what he inferred, okay? So there is definitely a kind of broken, sterile Nick, isn't there? A bit of a Wilson-like Nick, isn't there? And the city scene from the Queensborough Bridge, this is beautiful, is always a city scene for the first time. Hey, what do you recognize, guys? You can't go back in the past. But what about here? He transcends time for the second time. I've shown you two, haven't I? Two sections where in his narration he does exactly what he accuses Gatsby of doing. Because you see it over and over again, and it's always the first time, isn't it? In its first wild promise of all the mystery and beauty in the world. It's very rare to hear a city described in that way, isn't it? Particularly New York. So it's a highly romanticized version of New York. Extraordinary, really. Now, hypocrisy and money. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. Very different from Valley of the Ashes, isn't it? Here, even the air replenishes you and makes you young, yeah? I bought a dozen volumes of banking and credit and investment securities. This sounds like the young Gatsby, doesn't it? There's no indication that Nick is at all successful, is there? But here, He intends to be, doesn't he? He buys the books. We get one glimpse where supposedly he is studying, but it doesn't seem to figure again after that. He doesn't seem to have the drive and energy of the American enterprise, does he? Yeah? And they stood on my shelf and red and gold like new money. Is that just like the uncut pages of Gatsby's books, do you think? In his library, remember Owl Eyes points out the pages have never been cut, the books have never been opened. They're there for display. Well, I put it to you that perhaps Nick is a bit like that. Do you remember what I said? An observer and not an actor. Promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas, Morgan, and Maecenas knew. Midas, greedy, selfish guy. The gods cursed him by making everything he touched turn to gold, didn't they? Morgan, that's Morgan Stanley. So there's this beautiful triplets here. And Maecenas, who was also Augustus, as my classic students here know. Maecenas was the culture minister for the Caesar Augustus and was fabulously rich. Now it's interesting that Nick, who doesn't like to talk about money, etc., expresses such avarice and materialism here, looking at these books. Now, I think a good way of looking at the city and looking at many of the characters is to use Goffman's model of self-presentation. Very simple, really. Front stage, like I'm showing you, but in my heart, who am I? Perhaps a serial killer, all right? Backstage, all of this other stuff happens, doesn't it? We have to understand, essentially, the face is a mask, isn't it? Now, if we use this metaphor for New York, then what do we see? We see that we have a facade, but behind the facade, we often have hidden complex interiors, do we not? Yeah? Now, with Gatsby, again, my classic students will recognize Janus, the figure of Janus, the two-headed, the god of exits and entrances looking both ways, okay? There's the Gatsby here, sitting in the kind of aristocratic tea room, beautifully dressed, etc. But there's the Gatsby that knows how to get people killed, that knows about bootlegging, who through these telephone, and don't forget how important the telephone is in this novel. Right? Remember, the telephone's relatively new, and the telephone's always ringing and interrupting and disrupting, etc. Gatsby's always been interrupted at his parties with the telephone, isn't he? And the telephone reminds us of what? What's in the background of Gatsby's Hotel de Ville? Crime, exactly. Murder, bootlegging. So we mustn't forget that Gatsby knows violence in the dark underworld, okay? And Wolfsheim is very important in that regard, okay? Now, it's interesting the way Gatsby moves between worlds, doesn't he? But he has to be kind of undercover in doing it. But Tom too moves through worlds, doesn't he? He moves from the East Egg effortlessly to Myrtle's apartment, which he pays for, which is a kind of liminal space, isn't it? It's not quite in New York. It's in a kind of, as I say, a liminal space, a sort of space that's hard to define. And Tom moves into there. Does he have to feel fear? No, he doesn't. He's not like Gatsby, who lives in fear of being revealed. And of course, Tom also surfaces, interestingly enough, in the speakeasy, doesn't he? Where he's there getting drunk as well, despising bootleggers, etc. Tom represents the hypocrisy of this kind of New York gentry. He keeps on despising people. Interestingly, of course, Fitzgerald identifies him as a racist too, doesn't he? His favorite book is Rise of the Colored People. So Fitzgerald puts this kind of racist social Darwinism into Tom's mouth, doesn't he? Now, of course, a really important character in the criminal underworld is Mayor Wolfsheim. And I just want to pause quickly before I go on to Wolfsheim to remind you that when Nick gets into the car with Gatsby on the way to New York, do you recall that a policeman stops them? And what does he do? He gives him his card, doesn't he? Because they have paid off the chief of police. Do you remember this? In Baz Luhrmann's version of the film, the chief of police is in the speakeasy. I don't believe that that actually happens in the book. But there are very wealthy people who appear in that speakeasy. So what is Fitzgerald showing us? Front stage and backstage. So we see the front stage from the Queensborough Bridge, don't we? And then, of course, the speakeasy is the backstage, the underworld. Now, what's he showing us? He's showing us that there's a direct door between the two, isn't he? They are not separate, are they? They're actually porous, and people move between the two. The criminal class have to worry, but Tom's class, Morgan and Tom and all these rich friends, they move effortlessly between these two spheres. It's no surprise that The Godfather, the great gangster movies, are made in America and New York, because what Fitzgerald is showing us is that American capitalism is intimately linked to crime. And I think that that's very, very interesting. So now I move on to, how does the form of this narrative enhance the initial meeting with Wolfsheim? One of the great moments of the book, I think, okay, with the speakeasy, etc. Anything can happen now we've slid over the bridge. Even Gatsby could happen. He's showing you that Gatsby is also a mask, a piece of theatre. And immediately from that high point, have you seen how it's undercut? And we go into the dark world of Wolfsheim with his human teeth and his gigantic nostril hair that is kind of ugly to visualize, isn't it? And we have something that a lot of critics have talked about, which is Fitzgerald's vicious racism. When he talks about a black man in a car, he calls him a buck, the young Negro buck. You know, he uses that as zoomorphism, doesn't he? With Wolfsheim, I think it's even more sinister. It's an anti-Semitic trope, isn't it? He's not even described as having flesh, a human shape. The synecdoche uses his nasal hair as though he becomes like a bunch of talking nasal hair. So he's grotesque, isn't he? And notice the way he's described, a small, flat-nosed Jew. You know, there's something deeply unpleasant about it, isn't there? So this is Nick's narration, of course. Nick's contempt. Now, why is Wolfsheim such an interesting character for us to see? We have Nick's snobbery, don't we? He puts the dialogue into phonetic spelling. He went to Oxford. I probably didn't say that right. You know Oxford? And Nick says, I've heard of it. Do you feel the class difference there? And Nick sort of, It's one of the most famous colleges in the world. How long have you known Gatsby? For a long time, I inquired. Several years, he answered in a gratified way. I had discovered a man of fine breeding. Now, Dan Cody discovered a young sailor, didn't he? And he helped to make him. And now, remember I said Wolfsheim is second surrogate father? It's very important that we see, going back, guys, to front stage, Gatsby will become the front stage, won't he, for Wolfsheim's business. He is now going to be transformed into this persona of WASP, military glory, Oxford educated. But Wolfsheim doesn't have the education to see that the real wealthy will see through it, won't they? Wolfsheim doesn't see through it. He just buys all this Oxford stuff, and the fact that he can't pronounce it properly shows that he's not educated, doesn't it? Okay. On the other hand, we see Nick, who does come from Princeton, who does come from old money, even if it isn't a great deal of money, sees through this kind of veneer. He sees through the front stage very quickly and very easily. Okay. And then we're taken to one of my favorite moments, where Nick notices, I beg you, actually, Wolfsheim actually explicitly tells him of these oddly familiar pieces of ivory, finest specimen of human molars. And what are we reminded of? We're reminded of that Gatsby hangs out with really bad people that pull people's teeth out. You know, Wolfsheim is actually exhibiting their violence. Now, do you remember I spoke about the frontier being dead? Well, it's not that the violence has disappeared. The violence has moved from the frontier into the gangster-ridden prohibition American city, hasn't it? So let's not forget the front stage of Gatsby, all cool and calm and collected. Let's not forget the backstage. He knows that people are getting their teeth pulled out. This money doesn't come from nowhere. So it's very important that we understand the darker side. Why don't we know about it, Sam? We don't know about it because Nick chooses not to tell us. When we write about narrative, we shouldn't only write about what's present, we should also think about what the unsaid and the untold. And there's a lot here that's not told. Because Nick could have written a totally different Gatsby, couldn't he? He could have written a Gatsby who was a scoundrel, a charlatan, violent, a liar, a hypocrite. But he doesn't. He writes the great Gatsby, and he makes him into a kind of virtuous character. Now we'll come on to what Tanvi wanted to talk about, okay? By the time Nick leaves, by the time he's finished, and Gatsby, who's remarkably become his hero after he initially despises him, now he's become his hero, New York is now sterile. So those books that we spoke about earlier that would make him rich, like Maecenas, they seem to be up on the shelf. He seems to have no interest in it whatsoever. And he tells us that after Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. It links to Eckelberg, doesn't it? To T.J. Eckelberg. Nick can't see through the same glasses anymore. He can't see that New York from the Queensborough Bridge that he used to see. What does he see now? You could argue he sees the truth, couldn't you? Or certainly a version of the truth that's maybe closer to the kind of harsh reality that the New Yorkers built upon ruthless pursuit of money. So when the blue smoke of the brittle leaves, remember before the air was fresh, do you remember? It purified you, it made you young. Now there's the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, and the wet wind blew the wet laundry stiff. Am I right in saying that this sounds like autumn and he arrives in spring? As though the seasons, in a way, it's a kind of pathetic fallacy, isn't it? I decided to come back home. And presumably that's where the novel's written from. Because we mustn't forget the whole novel is like a recollection. So the earlier scenes of The Beauty of New York are early Nick, an imagined, youthful, idealistic Nick. Okay? And now we're in jaded Nick territory. So it's important you see these two different perspectives of Nick. Okay? So, in conclusion, guys, we begin with this remarkable wild promise, don't we, from the Queensborough Bridge. New York is an expansive area. He gets his house next to Gatsby and he's excited. Everything is about potential. It's really the American dream, isn't it? He's going to remake himself. He's going to make money in bonds. Everything is about potential. But this wild promise dissipates quite quickly. Initially, he doesn't see the money, does he? He says it's non-olfactory money. It's beautiful, it's white sugar lumps. But I would argue the money stinks there as well. It's just that he chooses not to smell it, doesn't he? Tom Buchanan's money also stinks, doesn't it? All money is got through a kind of ruthlessness and a mercenariness. We see, don't we, that the world of finance is intimately linked to the world of crime. And Scott Fitzgerald really is making a sort of, I won't say anti-capitalist, but anti-mercantile, anti-corporate view of the United States. I said earlier, and I'll repeat it again, I don't believe that Scott Fitzgerald is some kind of radical Marxist, socialist, or anything like that. I think he's a Burkean conservative who looks back to Jefferson's conception of America, that the landed, the deep South view of America, the Blanche de Bois idea, that it's superior to this kind of sordid, corporate, industrialized Valley of the Ashes America. So I think that that's an important theme. And I think that Gatsby was happiest, wasn't he, in the frontier, with his brown body, fit, healthy, living with vitality in the countryside instead of the sterility of New York. And ultimately then, New York becomes a barren landscape. One of the things that you could look up, one of the essays that I'm going to give you, is the link between this novel and T.S. Eliot's brilliant poem, The Wasteland, which Fitzgerald had read. They are from the same part of the United States, and they share quite a lot. A conservative view of the modern city as ugly, as disgusting. In The Wasteland, T.S. Eliot talks about London as the unreal city, filled with sordid affairs, prostitutes, drunken people, a completely dystopian idea of London. And I think that's what we start to end with here, don't we? With a New York which is also sterile, that makes people sick, and that doesn't offer the promise that it used to.